why I stopped hosting on Airbnb. So I got to a point where I had scaled my business to over $200,000, and I had all of these units across the city of Atlanta. And honestly, it had come with a lot of stress, stress that I didn't necessarily anticipate, that level of stress, right? Because initially I was in a 9-to-5, I was in a consulting career, and that was stress. And I figured in my head that when I walked away, like, it's the job that's stressing me out, right? That is, once I get rid of the job, things will be smooth sailing. I'll be an entrepreneur now. All is going to be great. And then I realized I was the problem, which was crazy. But nonetheless, when I realized that I was the problem, I had to do a check-in with myself on whether or not this is still what I really wanted. Now, some of you may be familiar with me from, number one, the tiny house video, where you may have seen the tour and the build of the accessory dwelling unit that I have in the back of my very first investment property. Or you might be familiar with me from the Crazy Stories series, where I talk about all of the crazy things that happened during my time serving as a short-term rental / Airbnb host, and the fact that I actually did get arrested at my unit, at one of my units, due to a tenant, or excuse me, let me be clear with my language, a guest that refused to leave and was squatting in my unit. If you want to see that video, I'll link it here. Just go back to it, check it out. It's absolutely insane. But when we're looking at why I stepped away from this, right? Doing that check-in with myself, I realized that I was becoming a glorified property manager for the most part. Like, even though I had a cleaning team, even though I had a management team, people that were helping and assisting, it still felt like I was in this industry that I really just came in only because I wanted to make some extra cash. My plan was not to turn this into a full-fledged enterprise. My plan was not to turn this into something that I would be doing for the rest of my life. It was really just to make some extra cash, and that's it. But what I found was, when the cash started to come, and it came so quickly, and it became so attractive, I kept going, and I kept scaling, and I kept doing it, not realizing the almost the hole that I started to dig myself into. Not necessarily financial, but more so the trap or the hole of, now the same way that I was running on this hamster wheel during my corporate job, I was now running on this hamster wheel trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to scale more? How am I going to make more money? How can I just do more, until I sat back and I had to ask myself, like, what is enough? When does it end? When does it actually stop? So I've touched on the stress that came with the business, which is one reason why I walked away, in addition to actually being arrested at my unit, which was something that was totally insane. Check out the story if you have not, but that put a really bad taste in my mouth. In addition to that, right? Another reason that I walked away from the business, and honestly, this is probably the biggest reason, and what really drove me and pushed me over the edge to say, okay, I cannot do this anymore. And that is the current state of the housing market, or at least the current state that it was at the time that I had left, which this is right around the end of 2022. So during this time, we all know that some crazy things happened with the real estate market pre, during, and then post-COVID, right? And I don't even think we're post-COVID just yet, but post-COVID is what I'm gonna call it right now. And the market changed and shifted so much. Like, we kind of started out and it was like, the buyers and people are going and they're buying and they're selling their houses and they're getting all of this money. And then it got to a point where rent prices really began to increase. So many people started to get into the Airbnb market. They started renting their spaces and they're getting top dollar for it, to where now the people who actually need this space, they have nowhere to go. And it got to a point, and I talk about this within my TED Talk as well, why we need to rethink housing. But it got to a point where there were people reaching out to me via the messaging platform on Airbnb or Furnish Finder or even Booking, and they're letting me know, like, they're coming to me very sincere, and they're saying, you know, I cannot afford where I am right now, or my rent has gone up so much to the point where I have to get something week by week right now, and is it possible for you to give me some type of discount, or do you have any availability at any of your other units? It even got to a point where a single father who had been living in a hotel or motel had reached out to me because he was so desperate and looking for something so that he can get closer to where his child actually went to school. And after the first couple of messages, it was like, oh, okay, like maybe these are just people looking for discounts. But But after more and more, receiving more and more of these messages, I realized that this is a real like epidemic that we're facing in terms of housing, right? And people needing this roof over their heads, because when they don't have it, and you're spending so much for the roof over your head, it now leaves less and less money for medical expenses, for you to do those things that, you know, your kids would like you to do and to be there for them. Now you have to work even more and you're not in the home. It's just, there's so many other factors that relate to just actually having a safe and comfortable place to lay your head. And it got to the point where I felt like I too was a part of the problem, even though I didn't have like 100 units, right? But even to me, 10 was more than I was comfortable at that point, especially coupled with the stress that I was already experiencing, that I said, you know what, there is a way that I can now become a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. So I then shifted, right? Like this is how I did it. You already know the why, now this is how. I shifted from renting on short-term rental platforms, or renting specifically for less than, let's say, about like a week or a couple of days or weekends, and I went to renting on a bi-weekly, at least a bi-weekly or monthly pace. And eventually some of those units actually then converted over into long-term units as well, like places that are fairly affordable, right, for the market that we're currently in, but they can stay there and they can get a 12-month lease, and they have a comfortable place to get their bearings, secure the finances that they need, save some money to then graduate to somewhere else. And that's really I would say one of the primary reasons, and is why that I walked away and I now stepped into what I do now. And what I'm doing now, because most people, right, if you've been a subscriber for a while, you might not have received an update. But with the tiny house that I have in my backyard, that's the major video that everyone saw, this accessory dwelling unit, I now have a startup where I help other homeowners who have extra space in their backyard and they want to create housing rather than just take it away. Right? Like rather than just take it up and say, okay, I'm going to rent it to the highest bidder, let me go use the property and the space and the backyard space, the basement space, I don't know, the garage that I have, and convert it into livable space that I am then going to rent out to those in need. And when I say those in need, this doesn't necessarily mean the unhoused population, right? But it could even be students, for instance, that, you know, housing is really unaffordable on campus, and then it doesn't help that it's now also unaffordable in many of our major cities as well. This could be seniors, you know, who are needing somewhere that they might need to downsize. This could also be, you know, workers who are in your city and they need to be closer to their place of employment. But thinking far more intentionally about how and who we're renting to, rather than just renting and playing this game of Monopoly, seeing who can get as many doors as possible. I'm really happy with my decision, honestly, and I can sleep a lot better at night knowing that I do not have that stress and that anxiety that came, at least for me, my personal experience, with being in the short-term rental business.